Yeah, so I guess we can start with sort of what we were just discussing about your paper that you presented today, which I'm very curious as to why sort of behavioral inquiry hasn't really been applied to civil service, public sector, and institutions, and sort of what we can start to learn if we follow this model of inquiry that you're sort of bringing to light here.
Well, it's very striking that in most of the research on behavioral economics, and not least when it applies to policy settings, we seem to have focused largely on citizens, taxpayers, consumers not making the right decision, savers that don't save enough, or people that should buy pensions and not buying them. So what I thought was interesting, not least since I was working at a time as a civil servant within a government organization, to actually not just assume that those people who work inside government make perfect decisions, and to use that as a way of both enlightening within the organization that we should be conscious of some of the typical behavioral biases in decision making that are well documented, but also to ask questions, what does it mean for the way we organize our public service, or indeed even firms. I was told that when Herbert Simon, he's a Nobel Prize winner in economics, when he was studying firms, and he was a psychologist as well, one of the things that he thought that industrial organization should focus on is also industrial structures and organizational structures within firms that actually can help to overcome some of these decision biases. So in my work, we just repeat standard experiments, like Kahneman and Tversky's classic loss aversion experiment, or experiments on sunk cost bias, or indeed on confirmation bias. And we find that actually the civil servants, they're also pretty biased, with in fact important consequences. Making wrong decisions around sunk cost bias means it costs the taxpayers money. Making wrong decisions when they are subconsciously or unconsciously affected by people's ideologies, while they should in fact be assessing evidence, are also resulting in bad decisions. And even though the individuals try their very best to do so, we better be conscious that these kind of biases also exist in these kind of organizations.
Thank you. So move on to the next question, which is about, well, I guess you research agricultural policies in Ethiopia. We've been speaking a little bit about different growth models and sort of to what extent do you believe that growth models should rely or sort of center on agricultural growth first? Why or why not?
It's often taken as given that because a lot of poor people are living in agriculture, surely any development policy that tries to help poor people should start trying to work on agriculture. Now, there is a logical fallacy in it. I'm not trying to say we shouldn't try to work directly with poor people, but they are typically employed in the lowest productive sector. And surely if we want to stimulate growth and development in a country, surely we shouldn't be focusing only on the lowest productive sector. So it's in that spirit that we have to be very careful to try to think about, is it really essential that growth should be initially started in agricultural sector? Now we know also, of course, that agriculture is the provider of food, and food is crucially important. So in closed economies, it would appear to be quite important that growth efforts are strongly focusing on agriculture to start with. However, if you're in an open economy and you are able to trade internationally, you could always import your food. And then you have to ask yourself very carefully whether it may well be more to your advantage, and indeed for growth in the economy, that you will start maybe exporting your natural resources, or trying to process these natural resources, or indeed start manufacturing and trade with the rest of the world, and use these resources from these higher productive activities to indeed finance imports of food. So these are the kind of things we should at least consider. I want to though add one thing, Poor people are typically employed in agriculture. In fact, you know, your average poor person in the developing world is still dependent on agriculture. So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay attention to them, but we may want to pay more attention to them because of distributional reasons. For example, if you're an oil exporter, focusing on agriculture would be a great way of ensuring that the growth you get from exporting your oil is actually have an impact on poor people. So you work on agriculture for distributional reasons and not necessarily for growth reasons per se. There's much more complicated analysis that you could go into, but as a rule of thumb, not just taking for granted that we should start in agriculture at all costs because of growth reasons is probably a safe starting point. So I've been lucky to be very involved some time ago in a series of cohort studies where we followed cohorts of children born in 1995 and 2000 in 4 countries. It was in Peru, in Ethiopia, in India, and in Vietnam. And what's really interesting about is that, in fact, these children are still being followed, that we can basically follow them essentially from close to birth into adulthood now. And the study is called Young Lives. It's based at the University of Oxford. And some of the papers I've been involved in are, especially some of my favorites, things like a paper we did once on gender bias, not so much in outcomes, but also into children's and parental aspirations for their children. So one of the great advantages to actually follow children over time is that you can ask the parents when the children are extremely young, what would you like your boy or your girl to do later on in life, and how successful do you want them to be in education? And you can then ask, when the children are getting older, ask themselves, what are your aspirations? And what do you want to achieve in life? And then you can later on look at what they're actually achieving in life. And even though this study is not causal, we didn't do a big experiment of changing their aspirations or whatever, but we actually find very interesting that in some countries, there's a huge correlation with what the parents at the age of 3 or 4 dream that their children will want to achieve in education, but the children themselves at the age of 10 or 11 dream of achieving in education, and then at the age of 15, 16, what they actually achieve. And so it's one of these striking things that biases are not just in outcomes, they don't come from structures, but they actually get created and procreated and recreated within the household, often from parents to children. There's no one to blame here for it, but it also shows how hard a job we have in trying to change some of these outcomes for girls or for poorer boys in some of these countries.
Excellent. And last question, we didn't let you preview this one, but in light of your talk that you're about to give, and as a civil servant, what is your greatest decision-making bias that you face and struggle with?
Well, I think that I am full of confirmation bias, and it's extremely hard. And I think as economists, as professional economists, we have a set of priors in the way the world works. And sometimes we don't have really strong evidence, and we fall back on theoretical assumptions that are quite untested to provide some insights in terms of how the world works or what is important. For example, we'll very quickly come back and say, surely this must have something to do with incentives. Now, I think incentives are crucially important, but we should just be very aware that people are not just driven by carrots and sticks, but they're actually also driven by other things, sometimes norms and values, their beliefs they have within about how the world works or what is right thing to do and so on. And so we should be very careful not to just reduce it all the time to incentives. So I'm pretty sure I'm full of bias because I understand incentives much better than some of these other things.
Excellent. I guess we can let you be on your way then and prepare. Thank you for